Her books have been read by millions across the world, brilliantly articulate, universal stories that everyone can easily understand, tales to get lost in, full of endless possibilities and impossible complexities, dripping with the contradictions and juxtapositions of life, so much suffering and smiling, so much energy and inspiration. It is this rousing talent that's turned Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie into a best-selling author, placing her in the top tier of not just African but global writers, in the elite company of Chinua Achebe, Wole Soyinka, J.K. Rowling, Follett, Brown and Alicia Walker, to mention a few. To read her fiction is to experience an awakening. But the best part of it is she's Nigerian. The world burns bright as we tell the story of my special guest today, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. I'm Charles Enyegolu, and this is the Arise interview. Now, I'm suitably delighted to say that my special guest today is the Nigerian writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. She's become a global star, one of the world's most acclaimed authors. Her stories are universally accessible, and there's hardly anyone anywhere in the world who doesn't understand them. Her celebrated award-winning novels include Purple Hibiscus, her first book, which won the Commonwealth Prize, Half of a Yellow Sun, which won the Orange Prize, and Americana, which not only won the US National Book Critics Circle Award, but was named one of the New York Times top 10 best books of 2013. She's also written The Thing Around Your Neck and We Should All Be Feminists, and more recently, Notes on Grief. Little wonder then that many of her leading fans are themselves celebrated, and they include Beyoncé, Barack and Michelle Obama, and Oprah Winfrey, as well as, of course, millions across the world. And I'm absolutely thrilled to bits to say that the effulgent Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie joins me now from Lagos. Great to see you, Chimamanda. Thank you very much indeed. Very honored, absolutely delighted to see you. And let me start by passing my condolences, and those of all of us at Arise News, the passing of your parents. I mean, it must be a very, very difficult thing to deal with. So you've got our condolences. But let's start from the very beginning and progress from there. I mean, you're a post-Nigerian Civil War child. You were born almost a decade after the war ended, but your parents were caught up in that fighting. Your grandparents died in refugee camps. Just pick up the story from there for us.
Well, first, thank you. Thank you for the condolences. And I was struck by that word you used for me, effulgent, which I need to think about for a little bit to know if it's apt. But yeah, so I like to say that I grew up in the shadow of the Nigerian Biafran War. And I was born in 1977, 7 years after the war ended. But growing up, and I think this is true for most people of my generation who are Igbo, that the war was still very present in the lives of my family, that I knew that this thing had deeply divided my family, had changed the arc of their lives, but I didn't understand it fully. My mother would often say things like, before the war, I had so and so. My father talked a lot about his father who had died in the war, and so I wanted to understand this period of our history for myself. And even as a teenager, I was interested. I was reading books about our history when I was 13 and 14 because I wanted to try and make sense of something that had real personal resonance for me. And so I started writing about Biafra when I was quite young. I wrote very terrible stories about that period. I wrote a terrible play that I hope nobody ever reads. And I like to think now, looking back, that I was kind of working toward what would then become Half of a Yellow Sun, the novel. And you know, it's in many ways also my way of trying to tell a story for my generation about things that happened before us, because we need to understand where we came from in order to know where we're going.
Very interesting point that you make there, and I think it's made more interesting because you actually wrote what has become a masterpiece without actually experiencing the war yourself. I mean, but let's talk a little bit about that growing up period. Did you have a lot of books to read? Was that a big part of your formative life and your upbringing?
It was. And I just want to say something about the idea of writing about a period that one did not experience. I think that actually there's a sense in which there's a kind of authority that distance can give a creative writer. And so I think for something that was so traumatic as the Nigerian Biafran War, there were people who experienced it who would not even talk about it, never mind write about it, because the trauma was too present. And so it seems to me that for major traumatic events, sometimes it then falls on the next generation or even the generation after to tell the story of what happened. I think this is true, for example, of Jewish people and the Holocaust, that what we're seeing now is that it is in fact the second and third generations who are telling the story of the Holocaust, because the people who directly suffered the Holocaust, that it's too close and too painful to write about. And so yes, when I was growing up, books were such a part of my childhood. I feel so grateful and so fortunate to have had books. I grew up on the campus of Nsukka, the University of Nigeria. My father was a professor there. My mother worked there as well as an administrator. And so I grew up in a family in which books were not just sort of important things that one read to go to school, but were considered almost sort of moral imperatives. You know, how could you not be interested in reading? And also as a child, I read books that I had no business reading. So when I was 10, I really was reading books that I don't think a 10-year-old should be reading. I read everything. I was interested in everything. I was reading books about the history of the Catholic Church. The only books I did not read, however, were my father's books on mathematics and statistics, because I couldn't make sense of them.
And I think that underscores the importance of reading and educating oneself. And you talked about your home was on the campus of the University of Nigeria, Nsukka. And I understand that the late, great Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe had once lived in the same house that you ended up living in. I mean, how much did that inspire you?
It really was a coincidence, and I can make up stories now about how I was inspired by it. And I like to joke and say that when I was growing up, because Chinua Achebe had lived in our house before my family moved in, that when I got up at night to pee, that I would hear literary spirits whispering to me. But of course, that's not true. The truth is that in my parents' generation, the academic community was a small one. And so, somebody would live in a house on campus. When they moved out, another family would move in. So it just happened to be a coincidence that the Achebe family had lived in number 305 Margaret Cartwright Avenue. And then they moved out and went to the US. And then my father, who had just been made the Deputy Vice Chancellor, was assigned that house. And so that's where I grew up, really. I spent most of my life there. And the fact that Chinua Achebe lived there was actually something whose, I guess, importance or symbolism became evident to me only much later, when I went to the US and I was telling the editor who was about to publish my first novel, and I was telling her, it's really kind of interesting that I grew up in a house in which Chinua Achebe had lived. And she said to me, that is the most interesting thing you have told me about yourself. And but really, I think of it as a coincidence that has a symbolism that I now appreciate. But I don't think, for me, it's not that important. Had I not grown up in a house in which Chinua Achebe lived, Chinua Achebe would still be an important part of my story, because I consider him the writer who gave me permission to tell my stories. And I mean permission in a metaphorical way, that until I read Arrow of God in particular, his novel that remains my favorite, I don't think I had real confidence that the stories of what I knew, stories of Igbo people living in southeastern Nigeria, people who ate mangoes instead of apples. I don't think I quite knew that those stories were worthy of literature, because I grew up reading a lot of children's books that were set in England and America, and I thought that's what books were supposed to be. But personally, Chinua Achebe, of course, was a friend of my parents, not a close friend of my parents, and I, in fact, met him only 3 times in my life. So he's not someone I knew well at all, but he is someone whose work inspired and continues to inspire me. I think he was just really a remarkable man.
Well, he absolutely was, but I have to admit, so are you. I mean, you're an absolutely remarkable woman, and that's why we're sort of going through methodically through your sort of history to get to understand a bit about why you became what you became. I mean, you were clearly a precocious child, because people who knew you then described you at the age of 8 as being a prolific writer already, as well as very confident and creative. But there's something interesting. They also mentioned that beyond being very good at school and at writing, rumor has it that you liked to look good too, and you were a sort of trend-setting dresser, apparently.
I'm not sure where you're getting your information from. No, I was. But I have to say that really, I have to say that my mother, my wonderful, brilliant, beautiful mother, Grace Adichie, is responsible for this. If you were raised by Grace Adichie, you had no choice but to care about your appearance. My mother would often say when we were growing up, she would say, "Igadika mado," which translates to you have to look like a person, by which she meant you have to look presentable. And when I think about it now, I'm just thinking about the layers of meaning towards the idea that caring about your appearance is about looking like a person. I find it very interesting. So I was interested in, as a teenager, I had ideas about clothes, and I think in the way that teenagers have different ways of showing their rebellion. I think one of mine was to be kind of unusual. So I remember, for example, going to a friend's birthday party wearing my brother's tie. And also I had all of these ideas for the clothes that I wanted to make. And there was a tailor in the market in Nsukka, poor man, Mr. Albert. And Mr. Albert really tried, because I would sketch just the most incredible things and give them to him and say, "Mr. Albert, you have to sew this one for me." And Mr. Albert would be like, "Okay, this one, does it go behind your back or in front of your body? Where does it go?" So really it was about me, in some ways, I think, expressing another kind of creativity. I still am kind of like that. I'm interested, I think in general, I'm interested in beauty, by which I mean not just sort of clothes and makeup and hair, which I am, because I'm quite a girly girl in that sense. I'm interested in femininity, but in a larger sense, interested in beauty. And I think that we can make a connection between that interest and interest in literature, for example, because I think literature is beauty. And I'm also interested in, I'm interested in trying to imagine the lives of the people from our past and to take inspiration from it.
Right.
So my hair, for example, I like to look at pictures of
I have to say, just
looking
at your beautifully manicured hair there, I mean, I can certainly relate to what you're talking about. But I mean, we will talk about the hair, but please stay with us because we've got to take a break. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with the award-winning Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Enyegolu. Now, my special guest today is the enormously accomplished award-winning Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who is celebrated across the world and who's become one of Africa's greatest writers. But you didn't know, did you, that she studied medicine for a year at the University of Nigeria in Nsukka before deciding that wasn't for her and subsequently leaving for the US at the age of 19 to continue her education education, but along a different path. Well, now you know, and that new path took her to Eastern Connecticut State University, from where she graduated summa cum laude with a degree in communications and political science. She would go on to get a master's degree in creative writing from Johns Hopkins University and another master's degree in African history from Yale University. And then it was on to Princeton and Harvard for further studies. And the award-winning Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie is still with me from Lagos. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us. When did you really get serious with writing? Because, I mean, as we mentioned there, you began studying medicine, but clearly your heart wasn't in it, was it?
No, not at all. I started to study medicine because I was told that that's what you did when you do well in school. And I think most Nigerians can identify with that, the idea that, you know, you're so bright, you have to study medicine. And I remember in JSS 3, the University Secondary School in Nsukka, and my result was the best in the history of the school, and all my teachers were excited. And then it was time to choose your subjects for SSS. And I remember just really being very keen on wanting to study history and literature and, you know, the things that I was interested in, and French. And one of my teachers said, "But you cannot be in the arts class. You have to be in the science class because you have to be a doctor." And so there was sort of this weight of expectations, and I kind of went along with it, although I knew that what I really wanted to do was to write. And it's what I had been doing since I was 5 years old. And so I figured that I would become a doctor, but I would still be writing, because writing was the thing close to my heart. But a year into studying medicine, I just remember thinking, I just cannot do this anymore. And I wanted to try and change the path of my own life myself. And so what I did was to then do the research about the SATs, the exam in the US. I told my parents I wanted to take the SATs, and then I had a sister in the US. So really, I just made an effort to try and make a difference in my own life. So I'm kind of a believer in trying. You know, you never know if it's going to work out, but try. And so I did, and I took the exams, and I got a scholarship to go to the US, and I was so determined not to study anything that was remotely a science, because I was sick of the sciences, because my whole life until then had been, you know, physics, chemistry, biology, which I kind of liked. I liked chemistry, but it wasn't where my heart was. And so when I got to the US, I majored in communication, and I did a minor in political science, because those were the things I was interested in. I also did not want to study literature, because I kind of felt that studying literature as an academic discipline can stifle your creativity. So you start to think of literature as something that has themes and morals, rather than thinking as a creative person, which is thinking about motivation of characters and love and you know, what the character aspires to. I think they're two quite different things. So it's the reason I didn't want to study literature.
So, I mean, it's just fascinating listening to you talk about yourself, because, I mean, I'm one of your biggest fans, I have to say. I've read all your books. And so you moved to the US in 1995, first to Philadelphia and then Connecticut, where you lived with your elder sister, as you mentioned. And that's when you began work on your first novel, Purple Hibiscus. Flesh out that period for us.
So that period, I was taking care of my nephew, my lovely, lovely nephew Tooks, who's now a big young man. He was in elementary school at the time, and I was going to college as well. So I would come back from school and take care of Tooks, cook, whatever. And then at night, I would stay up and write. So it was a period in which I really did not get much sleep, but I didn't mind, because I was doing what I loved. And I should say that, you know, in talking about when I became serious about writing, I've always been serious about writing. From the time I was 6 years old, it was something that I was deeply dedicated to, and reading as well. But I think that the question is, at what point do you make the decision that you want to be published? Because I think of them as two very different things. There are things I write that I don't want to publish. So I think when I got to the US, I started to really try to learn how the publishing process worked. And this was kind of before the internet was a big thing. So I would go to the library and get books about, how to get published, what to do to find an agent, that kind of thing. And I started reading them, and then I started sending out my manuscript. And before I wrote Purple Hibiscus, I wrote another novel, which was really big novel, which was not very good. And I like to tell this story because, I think that it's easy for a person to see someone who's sort of considered successful and think that it started easily or that it started overnight. I wrote a novel that nobody would publish. I sent it out to many publishers. It wasn't very good. The reason it wasn't very good is that it wasn't true to me. I had done a lot of research. I had seen the books that were doing well at the time, and they were kind of a certain kind of immigrant novel. And there were very familiar tropes in those novels. Somebody comes from another country to the US. The US then becomes this sort of beacon of possibility. And so I started writing that, even though it wasn't really true to me, it was false. And I think that's the reason it wasn't accepted by any publisher. And then I started writing the novel that I really wanted to write, which is Purple Hibiscus, the novel that came from my heart. I wanted to write about, Nsukka, where I grew up, and the kind of, what I like to call a kind of beautiful decline. And there's something about it also about romanticizing my own childhood and writing about the things that I think about in an intellectual religion, for example, and politics and military dictatorships, that kind of thing. And then I finished Purple Hibiscus and started sending it out and got many rejections because people said to me, you write well, but nobody wants to read about Nigeria. Nobody knows where Nigeria is. Americans don't care. And when I finally got an agent who said she was interested in publishing it, she said, I will take a chance with you. She said, you're not like anybody else writing, so I cannot say that you're the new so-and-so, because at the time, really, there was almost no African representation in contemporary fiction in the US. People knew about Chinua Achebe. They studied him in high school, some of them, and that's all they knew. And so I was kind of, here I was writing about small-town Nigeria, throwing in Igbo words in the book, because I had an editor who said to me, can you take out the African language? And I said no, because I think it's important to give to the world of these characters a certain authenticity, and the texture of the language was important to me. And so the case that I made with the editor was to say to her that, I said, I've just been reading a novel by Saul Bellow, who is considered one of the big American names. And I said, there's lots of French in the book. He has characters speaking French, and he has a lot of actual French. And I said, so if it is possible to have a language that's not English in a novel, surely we can have Igbo as well. So really, that's kind of how Purple Hibiscus was then published by a small independent publisher. People did not expect it to do well at all. And I remember when, I think it was my agent who then said to me, this book, people are reading it. And she said, the booksellers are hand selling it, because my publisher did not have a budget for sort of publicity. It was a small publisher. And so my agent said, we're really surprised people are reading it. The booksellers are hand selling it, recommending it to people who come into the store. It became an independent bestseller. So that's kind of the story of the beginning of my being published.
Well, that is an amazing story. And I remember when I read that book, absolutely riveting. Please stay with us. We want to talk with you some more. You're watching The Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with the award-winning Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Today I'm joined by a special guest, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, the internationally acclaimed award-winning author of Purple Hibiscus, Half of a Yellow Sun and Americana. She's also delivered 2 landmark TED Talks that went global and started worldwide conversations about about the danger of a single story and about feminism. The latter was published as a book in 2014. But now she's written about something completely different and deeply personal to her: grief. Dark, smothering grief about the sudden loss of her father last year, and she couldn't be with him. Sadly, a few months later, a second heartbreak because her mother also passed. So against that backdrop, and in a year of the pandemic, where so many lives have been lost, Notes on Grief has become a sort of muse, a powerful book about how it feels to be embedded in grief, something that will resonate deeply in the minds of everyone who's lost someone special. She said that it feels like she's living in a novel whose plot she doesn't believe. And the enormously talented Nigerian writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie is still with me from Lagos. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us. I'm going to come to grief, Notes on Grief in a moment, but let's just look at the period after Purple Hibiscus. You'd become very successful, you'd won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, and then came the book that put you in the stratosphere, Half of a Yellow Sun, an enormous success, going on to win Britain's Orange Prize. And it seemed that it was in that novel that you perfected the art of combining very big themes like war with human stories and characters that are very relatable. Tell us about that.
Thank you, by the way. Thank you for that characterization. It's, I think for most writers, you want to feel that your readers get you. And so thank you for that. That's kind of what I was hoping to achieve, which is to tell the big story about our history, but to do it in a very human way. I had been researching Biafra for years. I had been interested in it. I remember when my mother would come back with a newspaper from work when I was growing up in Nsukka, and often I would read the newspaper, and if I saw anything remotely about Biafra, often it was an interview with somebody who maybe, I remember reading an interview with Joe Achuzia, for example. I remember reading an interview with a policeman who was talking about how after the war, Igbo policemen were not reintegrated fully into the Nigerian police force, how they were not paid their pensions for many years. So I was interested and just kind of collecting information from every place that I could, kind of waiting to be ready to write this book. It took me about 6 years, I'm going to say, of just being really focused on Half of a Yellow Sun. The last 2 years in particular were just years of being hyper-focused. I wrote bits of it in Nsukka. I went back to Nsukka to be with my parents. I wrote bits of it in graduate school in Baltimore when I was at Johns Hopkins. And really it was, and I went to archives, I went to London to look at archives, I listened to radio broadcasts from that period. There was a lot in my research that did not go into the novel. But those things were important for me to situate myself in that period, to kind of, to have a feel of what it was like in order to then imaginatively tell the story. I wanted as well I wanted it not just to be a novel about battles. I wanted it to be about how do human beings change emotionally when they go through something so traumatic. And a lot of the book is based on my father's own experiences and my father's stories. There's a character in the book, for example, who loses his mother. My father lost his father. And just the heart-rending idea that not only have you lost this person who was central in your life, but you cannot go to say goodbye because the roads are occupied by Nigerian soldiers. And I know what that did to my father. My father, until his last days, talked about that, how for him he could not go to bury his father, a titled man, and how his father died in a refugee camp and was buried in a mass grave. And at the end of the war, my father went to Uke, where his father had died, and said, where was he buried? And someone just waved, sort of very vaguely, and said, the people who died were buried there. And it was this wide expanse, which was a mass grave. And my father says he took a handful of sand, and he kept that sand. And in some ways also, it's interesting because when my father died, and after we buried him, my brothers and I all took a handful of sand from his grave.
I'm very sorry about that. I can see that this is clearly a strong emotional moment for you. We'll come back to grief. Let me let you sort of settle a bit, and we'll come back and talk about that. Your next novel was Americana, your next big novel, which is about a Nigerian woman who emigrates to the US to study at university. It became, of course, a bestseller and one of the New York Times top 10 books of the year of its release, which was 2013. That really cemented your fame, didn't it?
I guess so. I mean, I really don't sit down thinking about my fame. And I don't want to sound falsely modest, so I'm not saying that I don't recognize that I have become, a public figure and I suppose a famous person, but the reality of it is that one still goes through all of the challenges of being a creative person, that you still have, that I still have moments of just intense self-doubt, moments of wanting to write and the writing is not going well, all of that. Americana was a novel that came from my having lived in the US, having observed America, and then kind of wanting to write a kind of humorous but serious take on America, in particular about race. And I also wanted to write a love story. I wanted to write something very different from Half of a Yellow Sun. Half of a Yellow Sun was a book in which I would often stop to cry while writing it. Americana was a book that I would often stop to laugh while writing. And I was surprised, very pleasantly surprised by how well it did, because I remember thinking that Americans would hate it. Because, I kind of poke fun at a number of American things, but it did quite well. And actually, I think Americana is the novel of mine that has maybe sold the most, I think. I think so. I'm sometimes very vague about these things, but I think so.
Read a lot, and I've got to be honest with you, all of them. I mean, I still can't make up my mind which is the best one. I mean, the brilliance of Purple Hibiscus, the epic scope of Half of a Yellow Sun, and the really captivating sort of story behind Americana. But then all that fame and recognition in America and across the West had its downside in Nigeria, didn't it? Because your father was kidnapped in 2015 at the age of 83 and was held captive for several days until a ransom was paid. I mean, to put it mildly, you must have been riven with anxiety.
Oh, that is in fact putting it mildly. I don't think I've ever felt the just range of negative emotions as I did when my father was kidnapped. And I was newly pregnant. I was in my first trimester of pregnancy, and I remember my mother just panicking, not just that my father had been kidnapped, but she was so certain that I would lose the pregnancy because I was just a mess. And then my father says, and when he was finally released, my father was just the loveliest, simplest, most decent man, and it was so important to him to calm us down. So the night that he was finally released, after my brother Oke had taken a bag full of money, got on an Okada, gone deep into some forest, dropped the money under a tree, and then left, and then we started praying and hoping that they would in fact release him, because we knew stories of families who had paid ransoms and still lost their loved ones. And when my father was released, he said, I'm fine, don't worry. Obviously he wasn't fine. He'd been there for days without his medication. He looked very gaunt. But then he said, they told me to tell my famous daughter Chimamanda to pay the ransom. And then my father adds, but they didn't pronounce your name properly, so I had to teach them how to pronounce it. And this was classic. That my dad, it was his way of kind of throwing in humor to try and make us feel better. But it was a very difficult time. My mother was so brave. She was the one negotiating with the kidnappers because they said they would only talk to his wife. And to have somebody tell you things like, you will never see him again. And we kept begging, could we please just hear his voice? And they wouldn't even let us hear his voice for the first 2 days. And then finally when they did, because all the conversations were recorded, my father just sounded so unlike himself, and all he said was, give them what they want. And they kept changing things. They started off saying, bring this certain amount, and the next day they said, actually no, bring more. And it really was a very difficult time. And I felt a kind of guilt, because I thought, if I wasn't Chimamanda, my father probably would not have gone through what he went through.
Yeah, that's the sad part of being a staggeringly huge success, isn't it? But what a great set of parents you've got there. And sadly, last year your father passed away, followed by your mother a few months later in March this year. And you wrote a deeply personal account of the loss of your father in a book called Notes on Grief, which was published in May. What a powerful essay. Just tell us what it must have felt like.
I started writing it maybe about a week and a half or 2 weeks after my father died. And I was in the US, the lockdown was on. My father's death was so sudden. The week before we'd been on Zoom laughing and joking. And then suddenly, he sort of felt a little bit unwell. And then before we know, he goes to hospital and the next day he's gone. And my brother Oke was with him. And poor Oke was completely traumatized. And I just didn't know what to do with myself. I remember when my brother Chooks called to tell me. And there's a feeling that one cannot describe. You feel suspended in a kind of disbelief. But at the same time, you do not have a choice but to believe it. And because I'm a person who's always turned to writing, I write to try and understand what I'm feeling. I've always done that. And so I just started to write. I didn't plan anything. And when I was writing it, I wasn't sure I would actually even publish it. And then at some point, I wrote it in a bit of it just came out in a rush in a few days. And I remember thinking, in a strange kind of way, that Daddy was helping me with this. I almost felt as though my father's spirit was present as I wrote. And that's what then made me think that I wanted to publish it, because I hoped it would help somebody else. And also because I wanted to just celebrate, I wanted to let the world know that he was my father. In a strange way, death is kind of a thing that wants to take away from you. And so I think for me, my writing it was my resistance. I thought, no, you're not going to take away this precious man. I'm going to memorialize him. I'm going to celebrate him. I'm going to remember him. But also I'm going to write honestly about what I was feeling. And grief is such a complicated thing. I'm learning every day how complicated it is. It's never straightforward.
Right.
You have a... Yeah.
I have to say, I don't even know where to begin, but my condolences once again, and I want to thank you exceedingly for being with us today, taking the time to talk to us. You're a busy person and we appreciate it. The writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie talking to me there from Lagos.